We have a really extraordinary panel here. I think we're very privileged to be sitting, well, I feel very privileged to be sitting here amongst this group who, as I said in the opening session, many of us live our lives on these platforms, much of our lives on these platforms, and I think we're just at the very beginning of the technology revolution. I don't know how many people have seen Her, but it sort of gives you an indication of what's to come. This is the very start of the technology revolution. So if this is just an indication, then these people who are sitting next to me and their companies are extraordinarily powerful. I might just actually get you guys to introduce yourselves just quickly rather than me introduce you, because I'm sure you can do it better than I can. So, Ross.
Hi, I'm Ross Lajeunesse, and I lead the team at Google that works on free expression, open internet, trade, and international policy, including internet governance, which I know is one of the topics that we'll want to dive into today.
Hi, my name is Joe Sullivan, and I manage the security team at Facebook.
And I'm Del Harvey, pinch hitting from Twitter in place of Tumblr. They both started with T, so it made sense. And I head up trust and safety for Twitter, which is everything from law enforcement requests to intellectual property to these sorts of issues.
So this is meant to be a super interactive conversation. It's a fireside chat. Anybody is welcome to ask a question and to make also a comment. We've got the Slido functionality, which means that people can put their questions up on the screen up there and we can talk to that. Or there should be some microphones roving. People can just come and grab a microphone from me. But please, I don't intend to ask all of the questions here. Also, you three should feel free to talk to each other. It doesn't need to come through me. Disagree with each other, agree with each other. I actually wanted to start off with the question about the Dalai Lama. Have you got anyone here met the Dalai Lama? Ross, yes. Anyone in the room? Awesome. Tell us what happened.
I haven't met the Dalai Lama while I was at Google. I was working in Washington on the Hill for a guy by the name of George Mitchell, who was the majority leader of the Senate. And the Dalai Lama came to visit, and so I had an opportunity to meet with him. It was pretty fantastic.
So the reason why I asked that is because recently the Dalai Lama was in the Bay Area, actually last week. And he said, even business needs a sense of ethics. He appeared to be asking for more compassion from the Valley. And I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Do you want me to answer because I've met him?
Yeah.
No, I think businesses that are successful in today's world do have a sense of ethics. I don't think that it's, at least at Google, it's not treated as an issue separate and apart from everything else that we consider as we go about how we run the company. I think at Google there's this real drive that if you put the user first, everything else is going to follow. And when you think about what the user wants, you think about it from the perspective of providing the services and the products that users want, but you also think about it in the sense of providing the experience and the interaction that the user wants. The user wants to feel that his or her data is secure. The user wants to feel and know that his or her data, that you're going to maintain this sense of privacy about that user. And the user wants to feel like the companies and the services that they're interacting with are doing the right thing. So we see it as part of everything else that we do, rather than a sort of separate, we've got this CSR component, we've got to tick some boxes on there. It's very integrated into what we are all about as a company.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that successful companies are the ethical ones. I mean, it's not that they're successful because they're unethical. And I think that's increasingly what we're seeing is that now privacy, for instance, is actually a determinant in the amount of customers that a company has. And maybe turn to Del on that. I mean, you might like to reflect on the Dalai Lama as well, but just this issue about trust with the user and how important is that actually to the business model.
So as the most public of the three platforms, we're probably the one that has the least information generally on our users, and users have the lowest expectation of people not seeing their tweets. People usually want other people to see their tweets in terms of usability. We obviously still have a lot of the same concerns and beliefs around the importance of users having an understanding of what information they're sharing and how it's being shared, and then control over how that information is being shared. And not just understanding, like they clicked a little box that said, yes, I understand, because that happens pretty rapidly, but a meaningful understanding where they understand what the potential ramifications of this sharing can be. And I think that for a lot of companies, it's challenging to balance what users expect and how users then behave in terms of, well, users expect it to work a certain way. They may not be, the company may not expect that to be the way it's used. So there's a lot, I think, of work that we as companies do on a regular basis to try to understand how our platforms are being used in ways that we weren't anticipating, and then building protections for that as well. And I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Let me jump in. That's a great point, Del.
Yes.
I really vividly
Done for the
remember-
fireside.
Go on.
I really remember coming to this event in 2011, and we've talked since then about the thing that left the lasting impression for me was we had a lot of different hallway meetings and conversations with activists from around the world who told me stories about how they had used Facebook in ways that I had never even thought of. Because we're sitting here in California building a product, and they were facing specific experiences that they needed to work around that weren't the base, when we were thinking of the product, they weren't the base use of the product.
Yeah.
And I took so much out of that experience, and that was the primary reason I was excited to come back again, was to hear how are people evolving in their use of all of our products.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're using them way ahead of the way we are thinking about them, and what can we learn from them?
So this morning I shared an Uber here with a gentleman from Uganda, not Richard, the one who I mentioned before, but a different fellow. And he was saying that there's a new law that's being passed in Uganda, which is called the miniskirt law, which is essentially a law that criminalizes the use of porn. I mean, not like just porn altogether. And people can be, like the police can come to you and raid you. And he was saying that, in fact, that the internet and the Facebook platform is kind of almost like the last refuge for them to be able to communicate with each other about the issues that they need to. Of course, the issue of porn is just, it's a sideshow. It's like they're setting up the infrastructure and the framework to be able to control content. And I think what we're seeing is that all over the world there are people who are using the platforms, Facebook and Twitter and Google, to be able to exercise their rights in a way that the platforms were not necessarily designed for. Coming back to this issue about ethics, I wonder whether you think that companies actually have an obligation to ensure the digital rights of their users. Not just because it's good for business or because it's about what they hear from users, but do you think that there is an obligation? And if you do think that there is an obligation, then how should or could that obligation be enforced? Because actually what we're talking about companies that are largely beyond the role of the state. Generally the state has been responsible for having the obligation. Should the company have an obligation and doesn't?
I mean, I think that anytime you start getting into obligation, you start wondering who enforces that obligation and what that looks like, along with, which digital rights in particular. But that being said, I think it's actually really important for companies to have a philosophy around these sorts of issues that is separate from whatever is potentially, okay, well, here's the mandatory minimum required by law. Having a philosophy around concepts like, it's important to defend and respect the user's voice. It's important that users have a way of appealing if there's an issue. It's important that users have a form of recourse. I think that we probably do have an obligation, not in terms of any sort of, legal requirement, but in terms of just being good corporate citizens, and in terms of giving our users a reason to trust us. We need to, do what we can to protect them.
The problem that I have with that is that, and I understand we don't want a regulated internet, but the problem that I have with that is that, and I know you, Del, for a couple of years now, we're almost reliant upon the person who is in that position of trust and safety at Twitter having this philosophy. If the company had employed somebody else, you have so much leverage in determining which data gets sent to a government security authority, who goes to law enforcement, to decide if something is real or illegitimate. That kind of flexibility, that lack of norms, that lack of legislative, perhaps, environment, puts the obligation or the duty onto the company. And that potentially is a question of personality.
I mean, to some degree, and I think both of these guys can probably speak to it as well, but there's actually a lot of industry discussion around a lot of these concepts. How do you handle these sorts of requests? How do you handle issues related to broader topics? There's a lot of common conversations, and maybe it's not to the point where we've said, okay, let's introduce some regulation, but we've agreed to different frameworks in other countries, for example, around complaint handling processes, or on some of these task forces. I mean, I think there is actually maybe some preliminary stuff that's already done.
Yeah, I spend most of my time in the world of technical security, and we would fail if we worked in a vacuum by ourselves, if we didn't open ourselves up to dialogue about what's the right approach. And when I've seen regulation that's tried to prescribe how security should be done, well, let's say I've seen it tried many times. I've never seen it work. So if you write legislation on what's the right technical things to do for right now to protect a particular type of information, in 3 years the legislation would be forcing you to do less secure
Let me
things.
jump in there actually to a question which is behind you, which is in the wake of the Snowden revelations, do you think that the obligations owed to users by internet companies has changed? How, or in the alternative, why not? So if we're thinking about, and as you say, it does become a bigger question, the sort of environment changes, so the regulation would need to be adaptive and continuously updated. We've seen a major development that's happened with the Snowden revelations. How do you think it has shifted that obligation or shifted the relationship?
I've seen a shifting in the relationship, primarily in that we now have more permission to talk about things, partially because we've all fought for it, and partially because there's a lot more interest. Partially you need to have, if we wanted to talk about encryption standards a couple of years ago, there weren't a lot of reporters who wanted to talk about it with us, and now there are many more. So if there's any silver lining on the Snowden situation, it is that there's a lot more attention on this, just both the front end lawful requests, or quote unquote lawful requests, and then also the technology side of it. I think I could say that all of our companies haven't fundamentally changed any of our practices in either of those areas, but we faced a lot of scrutiny, and probably all three of us feel really good about the practices we had in place before the attention came on, because we're generally speaking all still following the same practice.
Let's hear from Russ, and then we'll jump to the...
Well, I was going to say that I don't think the obligations have changed. The dialogue has certainly changed, and the nature of the relationships with our user has changed in the sense that there's a debate going on right now that, as Joe was mentioning, there are certain things we weren't even permitted to talk about. The receipt of national security letters, for example. And now there's a debate and a dialogue going on among our users, government, and companies that needs to happen. And the debate is a good thing, and I think we're starting to see it move government practices in the right direction. I agree that sort of our practices and the obligations that we felt to our users have been fairly constant, which is to keep that data secure, keep it safe, and it's really the government that I think is sort of changing its approach.
So let's hear from the audience. Anyone have a question? This is your chance. Yep. Yeah, if we can get a runner with a microphone, that would be great. Could you introduce yourself as well?
My name is Urvi Nagrani. I currently work for Oximity, but I've done a variety of media jobs in the past. The question I have is specifically geared towards Google because regarding user privacy and also accountability, my only experience attempting to document Google was when Consumer Watchdog had a protest outside of your Mountain View office. And I've traveled through Central Asia, I've gone through Russia and Ukraine. I've never had anybody physically put a hand in front of my camera until I tried to photograph a protest outside of the Google headquarters. And my question is, if you're not necessarily accountable to media here, and if your PR has enough support to block questions in this area, how can we trust that you're actually going to be accountable when you're giving us your privacy reports and other documents that we're supposed to take on face value?
Well, I would say, first of all, that I'm sorry you had that experience at our campus. That is far from the norm, and I apologize for that. But I think it's dangerous to take that example and extrapolate it out and say, therefore, Google doesn't care about privacy or is not accountable, because I believe that we are, and we certainly try to be, both to the media and to our users.
So the question then, how do I take what you believe and get verification for myself? Because you believing it, it's that same sort of, I'm relying on a private company whose internal documents I can't see, whose internal discussions I can't see.
Right. Well, first of all, I hope you believe me and that I'm not trying to, sell you a seaside house in Nebraska or something like that. But I think that there are, we do more than just talk about it. I think you should look at the way we conduct our business and the way that we interact with government, the work that we're doing, to reform the surveillance sort of apparatus, the work that we've done on transparency since 2010. I think that our actions at Google speak a lot more loudly and more clearly than our words do, and hopefully, again, it's, the unfortunate experience that you had at campus is not, I feel, representative of who we are as a company and what we believe in or the work that we do.
Let's move on, and if it's okay, perhaps you guys can talk more, because I don't think that you're totally satisfied with that answer, but perhaps you guys can talk afterwards, bilateral. But you've raised the issue, and I think you also raised it, of transparency and transparency reporting, and we're kind of now seeing a trend within the technology sector for companies to report on and to push for what they can report on as well, but to report on the use of the requests from governments for user data, how many they complied with. What sort of reporting would satisfy you? Do you think that you're now in a position where you are able to report as much as you'd like to?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, excellent. So the next question is, what are you not allowed to report on that you would like to tell us about?
Well, we're looking for a lot more granularity. We'd like to be able to report on the actual number of government requests rather than the range that we're now allowed to do. But that's progress. But before we couldn't even acknowledge that these things were going on. So it's progress, but I'd like to see us be able to report on the actual number. I'd like to be able to report on the types of requests that we're getting, whether it's Section 215 of the Patriot Act or 702, and also the specific number of user accounts that are affected. And those are all things that we can't currently do.
And add in the nationality of the people.
Okay. And Dale, from you?
I would echo what they've said. I think in particular, really, at least right now, the swath that we would theoretically be allowed to report in even if there were an argument to be made against saying, okay, report the actual, like the exact number, even if there was an argument to be made about that, the ranges that are currently proscribed are so broad as to be meaningless for the vast majority of companies that would ever receive or could receive these sorts of orders. And we'd also like to be able to report on what we have not received any of, you know, sort of not just here's the exact numbers on what we've received, but also, and we have not received any blank.
I mean, we're focusing on one specific subset, which is, you know, the national security letters, and you started off by saying that there is this pretty marked trend toward transparency, and that's not something we should just sort of gloss over. I mean, we're seeing company after company produce transparency reports, and that's great information for people to have. I mean, and every time that we release our transparency report, we're very focused on making it more granular, more informative. You know, we list out country by country the number of requests we get, how many of those we comply with, and I think that's, you know, that's a fantastic thing, and we're starting to see the telcos do the same thing, and we're all sort of moving in the right direction.
No, I mean, I have to say, we've spent a lot of time at Access on questions of transparency, which to my mind is actually, it's a good but insufficient response. Like, we want to see change in practice. We don't just want to see more information about bad practice.
Yeah, I
right?
totally agree with you.
And
But you can't have that conversation about what is good and bad practice when you don't even know the information. So it's a necessary first step, but not by no means the solution.
And great also, and I think a number of the telcos are potentially in the room who have also started to issue transparency reports. 2 years ago, I went to the annual general meeting of Vodafone, and I asked the chairman in front of a room of 2,000 shareholders whether they would issue a transparency report, and it was almost heresy. And then the whole, you know, I don't take single-handed responsibility for it, but there was the person who asked the question after me was asking why the font in the annual report was so small. But regardless,
Transparency in all things, you couldn't read it.
But I mean, I think this question of transparency is absolutely important, a great trend. But again, like, you know, we really do need to see some wholesale practice change, and I want to get to that. I see some hands in the audience. Andrew McLaughlin, Tim Carr. Andrew, do you want to go first?
I've got one. So one of the fundamental problems here for the companies is that your physical infrastructures span many different countries. You hold data in multiple jurisdictions. Those jurisdictions often don't exercise restraint when it comes to asking for data about users. If you could be sure that the US would only ask about US data and US citizens' data or US residents' data, the British would ask the same, the Brazilians would exercise restraint. One of the fears that people have about multinational internet companies now is that well outside any of the constitutional or legal protections that they may have for their own data from their own government, other governments may get access to it because they use your services. Can you comment on that and how you think about encouraging or promoting or pushing self-restraint by governments, and whether it's even possible?
Well, I think one of the big questions around transparency is not just the question of being transparent about the number of requests. Ideally, we'd have a world where governments are transparent about the number of accounts that they're collecting information on, regardless of how they did it. Because as we've seen from, I think, kind of like the second half of the stories, governments have been quite aggressive using technology to not just serve legal process, but to access information otherwise. And you know, for all of us, that's really disconcerting. And so if we can turn it around that way and talk about transparency in terms of accessing accounts. And then second of all, we'd love to see that not just from the United States government, but from many other governments as well.
Tim Carr with Free Press. Have any of your companies had serious conversations about moving your business models slowly away from big data? I mean, I think this will be a perennial problem as long as your businesses are built on aggregating data in this way. are there serious discussions? You don't need to give away any corporate secrets, but are there serious discussions about a future where big data doesn't drive the business model of your companies?
Yeah, I think we all, I mean, speaking from a security perspective, we try to be very thoughtful about the data that we retain because we have a responsibility to retain it with due care. And so I went through an experience a couple of years ago when we chose to set up our international infrastructure in the EU. So most of the people who use Facebook are interacting with our European entity, and so we're subject to European privacy law through that. And one of the principles there, of course, is that you don't retain information unless you need it for purposes of the service. I'm probably getting the legal phrasing a little bit wrong because I haven't focused on that side in a long time. But we went through a process with the data protection authorities where they looked at what data do you have and why do you have that piece of data and how is it used. One of the things that led to was we have a part of your profile where you can look at what we call your activity log, and so that you can see everything that's there and choose to delete it, et cetera. And so through that process, we became more transparent about what data we were a custodian of. And it also made us think about, and every time we launch a new product, what data would be collected, why do we need it? And I think you want to have that discipline.
Can I just a follow-up question on that? I mean, I think what Tim is saying is that if the companies weren't collecting that data, then surveillance, mass surveillance, would be very difficult for the governments to undertake. And so the question is, if you really are concerned about surveillance, is not the quick-fire answer, which has economic consequences, of course, but to actually collect less, or even not to collect, or...
I mean, there's one, I see one flaw in that premise in that, for the most part, law enforcement requests are not asking for anything. In the case of Facebook, the vast majority of law enforcement requests are saying, who's the person behind that account? So it's not even getting into communications or anything like that.
I mean, for us, we're in such a different place, I guess, that it would be hard for me to contribute too meaningfully, and that, we don't have a real name policy. We don't collect as much granular information about users, but, kind of again, hearkening back to users having a meaningful understanding of what information they're sharing. One of the things that we added relatively early on to your settings page is the ability to delete all the geotags that you've posted on your account. So for example, had you been geotagging stuff because you wanted people to know where you were and you'd opted into doing it and you'd said again, yes, I want to geotag this tweet. If you then decided later, oh, I actually don't want to do that, we've made it so that you can go and click a button and that'll be deleted, but the tweets won't be, right? Like I think that we all try to be mindful of both what we have and then also how we can let users tell us, no, don't take that, right? Whether it be, opting out of tracking or removing geotagging, and then also letting users understand, this is what we are using it for. I think that's a really major thing, But my company is in a slightly different position, so.
No, but it's much the same for us. I think the approach that we've taken is that this data actually makes our services better and work better for our users. And so our approach has been to give the user control over the data that is collected. We have a privacy dashboard where he or she can just sort of wipe it clean. Data liberation front where they can export it very easily and just leave us all together. There's always the option to use our services not signed in as an unsigned in user. So that sort of control and then transparency about what we do know about him or her is the approach that we've taken. Because we found that users don't enjoy our services as much when that isn't happening.
So, sure. Yeah, I think we're sharing a mic. So we have two questions, one here, and then we'll just follow up with you, and then we'll get a response from the panel. Could you introduce yourself as well? Can we get some audio on the mic?
Is it working? There. Okay. Thanks. Hi. My name is Kalia. My handle online is Identity Woman. I'm an independent advocate for the rights and dignity of our digital selves. And I, like many people, several summers ago, had our Google account suspended because we refused to send in our passport to verify who we were because our name wasn't name-shaped. And I think, you know, we can talk all we want about privacy, but if we don't actually give users the choice to define their own names online, to separate their professional lives from their activist lives, from their sex lives, and the only way you do that is by using different names with different email addresses in different contexts, because otherwise it's all linked together, you know, how are those sort of practical rights embedded within your system's functionality going to be maintained in the future? Because if you can, you know, and Facebook also has this tattle on your friends if they're not using their real names, and I really appreciate Twitter is not going this direction and sort of leaving verified. If you want to get verified and you're like super famous, like you can come to us and we'll help you out.
I'm still not verified. What
I
do I gotta do here?
I know. So, but like how going ahead are you actually, you know, all those folks in third world countries, they can still speak and dissent, but not give away their identities, but not if you guys keep pressuring people to use their real names all the time for everything they do online. So how are you gonna like maintain our freedoms in the way your systems work, not just on how much you tell the government when they knock on your door?
Thanks, Mike. Can you pass the mic over to the lady behind you?
Marie-Georges, French, and on behalf of the Council of Europe. I am surprised that you say so much that you are very much aware and that you want to keep the privacy of your users and everything. I'm very, very surprised that if you see, because each time one service comes up, new one, each time there is a problem. So I don't know, maybe you would need to be trained a little bit about the principles that US formulated first in the 70s, which are still very pertinent. But this is another story. About the report, the transparency, I think the case of France, well, it's true that we have a small, not legal system, not as big as the US, of course. And this is our problem, that we have to deal and to regulate it. But for the regular, I would say, secret services, we have an independent body which gives authorization, except in urgency, and they have to get it back afterwards. And also a posteriori control on the spot. And the transparency is made through their report, the annual report of that independent body. And so we don't make a difference between such or such services. I don't think it's a real good thing from the perspective of collective public interest. We don't need to know how many from Google, how many from Twitter or something. But the whole thing, but right as you said, per type of problem, how much, and by type of purposes. And maybe by the origin of the request, and how much has been asked, how much has been authorized, and the kind of reservation has been made. This kind of report exists in our country.
Excuse me, ma'am. Just because there's so many people in the room who want to speak, do you mind if I cut you off there? Thank you. Okay, so I might just get a quick response on this question of anonymity and real name policy. and because I think it's live. Like we talked about it 3 years ago, we talked about it 2 years ago, it's being talked about here today. Many of the people who are living and working on the fringes of the open internet require anonymity or pseudonymity. There's a panel actually tomorrow or the day after on this specific issue, but let's just get a quick response. Why hasn't Facebook changed its position on this?
So I don't think anyone at Facebook has ever said that there should be no anonymity on the internet. And that's not and we've never advocated for removal of anonymity on the internet. What we did was we created a service in which people use their real names. And even in that context... Sure. Got to put the microphone up here. Sorry. So we don't advocate for the removal of anonymity on the internet. It's never been our position. We created a service in which we asked people to use their real names because we wanted to foster certain types of relationships. And that's proven to be a very successful service. We've had lots of dialogue over the years as we've tried to figure out, well, like, how could we allow Facebook to be used for other purposes without undermining the core real-life communications that we wanted to promote. So in the context of Facebook, we have kind of come up with some mechanisms for people to have a voice without it being coming back to them directly through the use of pages. And we've worked with a number of different groups on how you could set up an administrator for that page so that they could manage communications without it coming back to an individual. When we get law enforcement requests related to the administrators of pages, that's an area where we're particularly sensitive and always scrutinize to see if those are related to expression. And so we recognize there's a tension between creating an anonymous communication platform and creating a real name platform, and so we chose to create a real name platform.
I mean, I don't see the questioner, the user, very satisfied down there. So I don't know if there's either of you who would like to comment on either this issue before raised by the lady over there or on anonymity.
I mean, I certainly can. I would say that for us, where Facebook very much went for the sort of real name, real world people you already know or know through others sort of interaction approach. Twitter has always, or at least from the beginning, was kind of built with this: you can follow who you choose to follow. It doesn't have to be in both directions. You choose your identity. It's a different model and a different use case, and we certainly believe very strongly that for us at least, identity is not inextricably linked with the name that you were born with. Your identity is what you choose it to be. That can be fluid. It may not be the same as it was yesterday or 2 weeks from now, and that's because you own that part of your identity. But there's, I think, different places for different services in this sort of hierarchy almost of use cases.
I mean, I think this again comes back to this issue of terms of service. Like, the company is deciding a question of rights because of their own internal business model or the sort of perspectives of the investors or the owners or even the staff. I want to actually raise a question which is not about policy, but is actually about technology, and for you, Joe, which is, and it's actually raised up here. It says, Yahoo was unaware of the webcam spy program Optic Nerve that allowed the GCHQ to record 1.8 million users' private webcam chats. What prevents this exploit from being used on Google and Facebook? And we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, which is like, fire the lawyers and hire the engineers. Like, what is to stop governments from hacking into Facebook or Google or Twitter if the technology itself is not robust enough to repel them?
I think that's a really good and really scary question. I think the thing we've learned is that they're not going to stop trying to do that. And so there's probably a lot of anger inside the engineering teams and inside a lot of companies right now. we would like to suggest that transparency would be ideal. I mentioned earlier, if governments had to be transparent about the number of accounts they were accessing. So if GCHQ had put out a transparency report that said we accessed 1.8
This is how many we hacked. I mean, yeah, it's true. Like, we do obviously want transparency from government, but this is also the obligation. And back to this obligation question is like, how are you going to be one step ahead of those governments? And it's not just actually governments. It's also non-state actors. You know, employed groups that are actually recruited and contracted to hack the services. Particularly, I think, as Andrew McLaughlin talked about, this like transfer of data on fibre optic cables across jurisdiction. So,
well, hopefully what we'll see is a lot more innovation in the private sector around these types of issues. I was in the downstairs space during the last session listening to people debate different technologies, and there's a lot more of that debate happening in a lot of different places right now than there was a little while ago. And I think that's a good thing. The more we develop secure technologies that can be usable and implemented on larger platforms, the better.
Yeah, and I mean, even in terms of like the shift to SSL on by default, for example, or the increasing number of companies that are implementing forward secrecy or perfect forward secrecy, like you're seeing continual innovation in terms of security components, not just at the level of, okay, how can I keep somebody from accessing my account? We all have two-factor, but also how can we make sure that, you know, nobody's seeing this who isn't meant. Like, there's just, we're never going to be done.
Yeah.
We're never going to be able to say, okay, we're done with this.
but what happened with Yahoo, and I'm not sure if Yahoo is in the room, but certainly they're at the conference. I mean, this is not innovation. This is just laziness, to my mind. Like, how is it possible that Yahoo would enable the government knowingly? I mean, they're in a position where their data is not encrypted and they don't have TLS by default, or perhaps they do now. But like, you know, is there Yahoo in the room? Bella?
And if so, do you really want to identify yourself?
Identify yourself. There's no anonymity here. So, yeah.
But I think rather than looking backwards at what Yahoo did in the past, let's look at what can they do going forward and how can we all help each other get to that place. I mean, we see that, you know, Yahoo's, they just announced they're hiring they're hiring a really excellent head of security. And they're going to keep investing in this area if they want to have a brand that's trusted. We're all going to keep investing as well. And there's a lot of good sharing of best practices. You know, people are contributing to OpenSSL. There's a lot of different ways that you can help us all get better.
No, I think Joe is exactly right. What you sort of did is say, oh my God, I can't believe that happened, but Yahoo was lazy because they let it happen. And I understand the anger and the argument, and it is up to the service providers to be many steps ahead. That's true. But some of the revelations that we've seen, I mean, were just basically astounding. That people just, you know, when we found out that the government was allegedly sort of tapping into communication between our data centers on a private network, I mean, it was, you know, we were horrified about the revelations, and we really have been, we feel at the forefront of encryption, you know, by default since 2010 on Gmail and search in 2011, and we felt like we were definitely staying a couple steps ahead. But that's what that points out is why the debate is that we're having now is so important more than anything else.
Questions? Yep. Questions from the audience? Anyone else? Back there? Yep. In the back. And here, look up.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember a lot of history. And
just so before you go on, if we can keep it nice and short as well, because there are a number of questions, not that I'm suggesting you're going to be a long time, but when you start talking about history, people start getting nervous.
But I think a big problem is complacency with individuals, not necessarily what the government does. And it was brought up earlier. Years ago, to have the picture of the front and back of your house and everything would have been just unbelievable, available to anyone. Nowadays, are we going to have a camera on every street corner? So individuals say, oh yeah, it's good security, I can see who's going in front, or I want face recognition to identify people or cars. And when people become more complacent, then the government and the private companies then will move in and say, well, we can sell this information or whatever. Am I going to be able to buy the emails from another individual? If someone at some future date says, hey, if you want to pay $50, we'll give you access to somebody's emails.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question right up back there. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that while we were talking about anonymity not needing to go away, that Jillian York, who couldn't be here today, pulled up an article where it actually says Randy Zuckerberg from Facebook says online anonymity has to go away. So I think probably we need more on that. But really what I wanted to do is ask my question here, because we haven't gone back to the Slido, which is
Of course.
Yeah, are you going to do that
No,
later?
please, go for it.
Yeah. So how much training on human rights issues are you doing at your companies for people who are not in your policy offices? How are you educating people about the conflicts with digital rights and technology? It seems like companies who really are committed to digital rights would make that a part of everyday conversations. And what kind of human rights reviews do you do when you're developing new products?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very pertinent question. And it brings up that issue that I raised before about individuals who are within companies making decisions. There are practices, human rights trainings, human rights diligence that are acknowledged and certified. And I think that they're, again, coming back to this question of obligation, there really is an obligation. I mean, I don't know if people have read, and maybe Joe Sullivan probably wishes this article from Forbes is not, the first thing that you see when you Google him. But, basically they say that Joe Sullivan is responsible for the security of 1 billion users. And that makes him, in a way, more powerful and more important than the person who heads up the Department of Homeland Security. So I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's basically what it says. But the question is, you have a team, and you all have teams of people. What kind of information, what kind of training do you give, particularly to the engineers who are more looking at ones and zeros rather than policy positionings?
We do quite a bit. We can always do more. It's something we've talked about a little bit in the past. I guess it was 2 days ago, we had an event at our office where we brought in a bunch of, sorry, I feel like I'm using the mic, I'm sorry. I can hear myself well. We do have quite a bit of engagement inside the company and not just with our policy teams, if you will. I'll give you 2 examples. Earlier this week, we had an event where we brought in a number of representatives from different organizations and had the people who are launching different products at Facebook in the near future and in the recent past, and had them talk about what went into those products and get questions from those organizations. And it's really important to have that dialogue. I was on a call this morning where our chief privacy officer was talking about it, and she said, the team that's launching that product that's coming up, they got some really good feedback. The second example I'll give is one of the teams that I manage is our team that handles all of the law enforcement data requests. And one of the things that you probably don't think about for the people in that job, but they have to stand in front of law enforcement officers who are used to never having anyone say no to them. And if you've looked at the transparency reports of all of our companies, you'll see that we're all saying no quite a bit, because almost every request is overbroad and quite a few of them are illegal. And so we all have to hire teams of people who are going through these requests with a magnifying glass, and then they have to say no to this officer who's maybe his brother's the mayor, or maybe this is their first online investigation, and they're used to walking a beat in a community where everyone says, stands up when they come walking down the street. And so we recognize that team inside our company is constantly getting barraged with pressure from that one side. We have to have them calibrated, and so we have different organizations come in and kind of present and tell us, no, you should be doing more. If we didn't have that counterbalance, it would lead to not the right approach, I think.
Yeah, no, it's very much the same for us. I mean, when we should be doing this, but we devote an incredible amount of resources to that task that Joe just described. It would be the easiest thing in the world for us to just roll over and say, well, all right, what do you want, and hand it over. But when you look at the transparency report that we produce, you recognize how rare that is. It takes a huge amount of resources to fight, and first of all, to take each and every request, examine it, and then fight back if it is overly broad or it is illegal. But we do that because we recognize we owe that to our users, and we have that obligation to do so.
And I think this is the question about digital due process, which is how do we ensure that the protections that are existing in the offline world are brought into the online world, and people know about the necessary and proportionate principles which set out exactly those steps. And I think what we are in the process, where we are at the moment, is this period of norm building, which is not necessarily regulation, which I think the companies are definitely resistant to, but the creation of norms across companies and across the sector whereby information is not handed over unless there's a competent judicial authority that's issued a warrant. Information is not handed over unless there's some kind of connection between the purported offence and the surveillance that's used, or the law that's trying to address that issue. And so, this is part of it, is about necessary and proportionate. The other part of it, which we mentioned before, is about encrypt all the things, which is sort of the policy and the technical side. And I think we need a duo. We need both of them working in kind of pincer. Del, did you want to mention?
Yeah, I was going to just speak to the concept of training and how you raise awareness in the folks who are not necessarily dealing with these kinds of issues on a daily basis, because that's actually something that we're super conscious of. Most folks who are working in product or engineering are approaching things from the mindset of, I've built this awesome, amazing thing, it's going to let people do wonderful things. And you say, well, somebody could also use it to do this bad thing. And they're like, well, why? And then you have to be like, no, but somebody will. Like, somebody will use it to do the bad thing. Like, let's explain to you why we have to build in protections kind of from the ground up. And, one of the strategies that we've actually employed to try to get folks across the company thinking about that is, every PM at Twitter who's launching features, whether they be internal, external, whatever, is actually assigned a representative from Trust and Safety who will attend their stakeholder meetings from start to finish and just give input throughout, like, hey, make sure that you're thinking about X, make sure you're thinking about Y. Did you realize that this could also be used for Z? Because it's really, really challenging for the folks who are building and developing things that they're, imagining are going to be, there's just this inherent cognitive dissonance to stopping and going, and how will all of this also go horribly wrong?
So I'm seeing a lot of nodding between the three of you on various things. Have you guys met before?
We've never met.
Neither of us have met Ross. We aren't entirely sure if he's, even
So, well,
after we don't know what's happening.
The reason
but
why
Joe and I are besties, so
Okay.
it's good.
Del and I were at a working session on suicide prevention a couple of weeks ago.
This is my question, really, is like how much time, and Ross, maybe this is your bad, that you should be spending more time with these guys, but like, we're trying to...
He doesn't call, he doesn't write.
He doesn't read.
I'm one of those horrible lawyers that you were talking about
Right,
earlier,
but-
policy side. These
but what
guys
we're-
really build this stuff. And
But what we're talking about is like a race to the top. And I think what users have a concern with is that there has been a race to the bottom, certainly in terms of government actions and potentially in corporate actions as well. And so this kind of exchange, and it's great that it's happening here on stage, and it's that it would be really, really good, and there are bodies like the GNI, for instance, and other coalitions where there is an opportunity. But I think that certainly myself and probably members of the audience would be happy to know that you guys are working out what is best policy in the absence of regulation, what is best practice.
Well, don't take the fact that I haven't met Del or Joe
I've seen
before as an
lots of his
indication.
colleagues
I mean,
do this stuff.
just because I'm not involved in sort of those engineering technical conversations doesn't mean that they aren't happening, because I know for a fact they are. And you mentioned the GNI, which is a place where a lot of those conversations also happen. An earlier question was talking about this issue of how do we ensure that companies are working together and doing the right thing, and GNI is actually a locus where those conversations are happening every day.
So I think we should switch gears for a sec. I want to talk about, and hopefully you want to talk about as well, the issue of governance, the issue of internet governance. I think some people here certainly know that there's a battle for governance of the internet that is taking place in every international forum that I know of. It doesn't matter whether it's the General Assembly, the ITU, ICANN. It's real, and in fact, maybe Ambassador O'Donoghue is here. She sat on the Human Rights Council for 3 years, and she said that I sat through the discussions and advocated on the discussions on Syria, on North Korea, on every protracted battle that you could imagine. But she said the hardest fight and the most fractious disagreements in the Human Rights Council were over the future of the internet. And she said, and you know why? Because who controls the internet controls the future of the world. And that battle is actually taking place right now. And I wonder, we saw what happened with the World Conference on International Telecommunications, WICIT, at the end of 2012. We have a whole series of events that are taking place this year. Maybe we could hear from you in terms of what you think is likely to happen in governance, and you could perhaps reflect upon the kind of perceived and real control of ICANN as well, and whether there needs to be some internationalization of that body.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I lead the team that focuses on internet governance at Google, and as you know, Brett, we were very engaged in Dubai at WICIT, and we were engaged far before then, and we continue to stay engaged because we share the concern that you just articulated. We've got a conference in Sao Paulo at the end of April, which is being hosted by the Brazilian government, and we're slowly finding out more information about what that conference looks like, what the outcomes will be, and it's sort of a precursor to what I would say is a much more dangerous conference in Busan, held by the ITU, at which the ITU will rewrite its constitution. And there will definitely be a push by factors within the ITU and by many governments there to put the internet and internet regulation firmly in its constitution, which we think would be a horrible idea. So we're engaged on all fronts. We're working with civil society. We're directly lobbying governments who share our concern about the future of the internet and internet governance. We're drafting submissions right now that we're going to be finalizing for the Brazil conference. But I agree with you that the threat is real, and the danger is that what you'll have is this, call it an unholy alliance of countries like Russia and Syria, China and Iran, who don't like the way that the net is currently run through the multi-stakeholder model, and they will use the ITU as the vehicle for changing that model, for increasing government regulation.
Just to push back a little, I think some people feel as though multi-stakeholderism as a term is really just a disguise for US company and US government maintaining its control over the internet, and that in fact other forms of governance are distributed amongst all nations, and that the ICANN relationship with the US government and the dominance of US companies is something that you guys like just fine. And so, of course you'd be scared and see it as a dangerous activity within the ITU.
Sure. Well, we are supportive of the ICANN moving to a model where it is a global model and not just U.S. corporation with U.S. functions here. And we think that's a good thing. But a lot of the folks making the argument that you just made are actually the same folks who are using the NSA revelations and using that as a starting point for having this discussion about taking control of the internet away.
Let's turn to the crowd. Yeah, Luca.
Good morning, Luca Belli. I work at the Paris University. I'm the founder of the Dynamic Coalition Net Neutrality of the United Nations Internet Governance Forum, and I'm serving as a net neutrality expert for the Council of Europe. So now that I introduce myself, just a comment and a proposal. The comment is, I think everyone has understood that terms of service of platforms have more or less the same capability to shape users' rights that the law of the land has, because they can limit fundamental rights, they can extend them. But the problem is that the law of the land is framed by a constitutional framework, is reviewed, there are some checks and balances, and the private regulation of the terms of services, it is not framed by any constitutional framework. So if you have law of the land versus law of the cloud is not framed and is essentially private. So the proposal is, would you engage in a collaboratory effort to create some model provisions that can protect human rights, and with a framework that can be associated with some sort of rule of law or due process mechanism that can be applied? Would you engage in such a collaboratory effort? And I look forward to your answer.
I want to address this view that somehow companies are not subject to the law, and it's just not the case. The terms of services that we have, our entire operations are subject to the law. And I think there's this sense, and I think sometimes I think about the blame that internet companies bear for this, that there's always been this talk about this digital exceptionalism, right? That your laws don't apply to us, we're going to go off and do what we want, and that's just not true. So I don't think it's really helpful to talk about terms of service on this level of, well, they're actually more powerful than the law. They aren't. Our terms of service do not trump the U.S. Constitution. Our terms of service do not trump U.S. law. I mean, what we talk about, of course, is that we're global companies, and so we're subject to various sets of laws and various jurisdictions all around the world, and that's actually one of the reasons why, when we propose the principles for reform, we address that very fact, that there are conflicting jurisdictions and conflicting legal models that apply, and we're asking for some sense of sanity, for some sense of, mostly through MLAT reform, but I just want to dispel this myth that somehow we operate in the heavens and we aren't subject to any of this stuff.
I think that's true. This conference, however, is about human rights and technology. And what we would argue, and certainly the International Human Rights Framework, it talks about and has been accepted that this is universal and that it is not subject to local law or cultural boundaries. I mean, this is really about the right to privacy is the right to privacy, as we put up on the screen before. The right to seek, receive, and impart information is enshrined, not just in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but in all of the regional human rights treaties. So this does kind of pose a question, and again, it's also about jurisdiction as well, but how do we ensure the primacy of the International Human Rights Framework across all of those 195 jurisdictions in which you operate?
Well, I was actually just going to say that I could have been wrong, but I think part of the question was also just, shouldn't users have a way to appeal if something happened and they didn't like the outcome, right? In normal law, you can say, well, I'm going to take this to the next court up and ask for their judgment on this because I think you were wrong. And I think all of us have an appeals process for, you were suspended because we received, X number of DMCA notifications and you didn't file counter DMCAs for any of them, and at this point your account is suspended. Like, you can write in as a user and say, hey, I don't understand what happened. I think that the challenge for all of our companies is to make that process as clear to the user, both perhaps the one that's reporting what they find problematic, and then the user who has their content reported. Just making it really clear to both parties what's happening, why it's happening, what their options are, and why their options are what they are. I think that's something that we have made some strides on, but we have to keep working on. And I think that that also is something where being aware of cultural norms within different communities is actually really important to take into consideration, because even just verbiage, or even just the way that we might say something in this country would just have a completely different effect in another country if we did a literal translation. So.
Yeah. But we're also talking about remedy now as well, because the Ruggie framework, which I think many people in the room know about, is very clear that there's respect, protect, respect, and remedy. And that companies are both, their duty actually goes to that third leg as well, which is not just about having a complaint mechanism or review mechanism, but is actually about making good on human rights abuses or human rights violations that take place because of that service. And this, when we talk about law, I mean, this is now established international law. So I think it's the next step, and the telecom sector is also starting to think about how do we employ remedy. And some of it is about companies actually making good upon those impacts, those human rights impacts. And part of it is about judicial remedy as well, of course. So I'm not sure how much more time we have. I have a question, a series of questions up the back. Let's get a question here and one there, and then we might need to wrap so that we can have a cup of coffee before the next session.
Hi, I'm Kavitha from the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I wanted to follow up on what Del was asking about the right to review when decisions are made. And there's been a lot of concern from journalists and human rights activists about Facebook's takedown of some pages related to the Syrian conflict. And I just wondered if Joe could take us through the process for reviewing those takedowns, and when there is a reason to appeal, how do people even go about that? And what's the status of the controversy right now? Like, where do things stand with those pages?
I haven't been involved in the specific pages, so I'm not sure of any of the details of the specific case. But if we could meet afterwards, if you could give me that information, I can follow up on it. I think we all always want to get to the right answer. Over the years working at Facebook, I've found that we are frequently criticized by people on both sides of every issue for censorship. And I can honestly say we're not trying to censor anyone. Our goal is, and our mission as a company is to create a platform where people can connect and communicate openly. And so we don't want to take a view on any issue. We want to be a neutral platform where people can communicate. We sometimes do make mistakes when we remove items. The more controversial something is, the more times it gets reported, for sure. And what we do to try and get the answer right is we try and hire people who are grounded in the different cultures around the world, who are native language speakers, who can evaluate the content from the right perspective and understand it. And so we mostly get it right, but sometimes we get it wrong. And then if it's a high enough profile thing, it certainly gets written about. But we do have appeal mechanisms built into our service so that the person who has their account disabled can write into us directly as well.
Hi, my name is Jabu. I'm from South Africa. I do LGBTI media reporting in the continent. I'm really concerned about the use of the words like tradition or cultures in contexts, especially in the continent where homosexuality is becoming more and more criminalized. We're looking at Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, Zambia. I mean, I can go on and on. Facebook is often a platform for us to use to express concerns of vulnerability. I'm wondering, to what extent do you gather that data in order to advance human rights at all? Do you do that? I also want to know specifically around why do you choose to use facial recognition software on your with photographs? And lastly, I had a question earlier about WhatsApp. You bought the app. Are you going to be doing any codifying encryptions? I believe it's unencrypted. It's a platform that most people use because of its affordability. So I'd like to know about the securities on that.
Okay. I'll take them in reverse order if I can, or might have to ask you. All right, I'll start at the beginning. We have not aggregated, we don't try and aggregate information in the manner that I think you were asking about. And when we talk about respecting cultures, I'm thinking about in terms of the way we communicate and understanding local standards, not supporting some kind of repression. So I'm sorry if I gave that misperception. With regard to WhatsApp, the lawyers would say that transaction hasn't completed, and so WhatsApp is still an independent company, and we're not allowed to engage directly with them on their security practices. I think that as a bystander, I've seen that there's been a lot of lack of understanding of the encryption practices that they do have in place, and I think that some of the stories have been corrected in the last week or so, and that they do have a certain level of cryptography in place and use SSL. I can say that when they do hopefully become part of the Facebook family, we will be excited to work with them on their security practices and keep moving them forward.
So I might just finish up by asking a final question. We started with the Dalai Lama, a question about compassion, and I wanted to ask you a question about, the title of this panel is about digital rights and how do we ensure these platforms respect digital rights. If you were to pick one principle or one concept, what would be the guiding principle or concept that you would like to see your company employ in respecting the digital rights of your 1.8 billion users collectively around the world?
Can I have two?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can have two.
I think the key, Matt is saying no, I can't have two. I think what we remain focused on is giving users control, giving them the information, the transparency element, and then giving them control over how they interact with us, the data they give us, and how that's used. So it's really two things.
I think we need to keep being open to feedback in particular. I didn't come to this event today because I was trying to convince anyone about anything about Facebook. I signed up for this conference because I wanted to hear the hard questions that people were going to ask, and I want to have dialogue with people here about what they're disappointed in.
Microphone, please.
I want us to be open to your feedback, and I want us to keep coming to these events. I want you to keep putting on these events and keep inviting us so that we can continue to learn and continue to get better.
So you'll be pleased to know that there's a number of roundtables that are taking place between each of these guys and a room full of activists who are working and living on the front lines. And if people would like to attend any of those, please come and talk to me. Lastly, from Del, from Twitter.
I would obviously echo the transparency concept as a whole and control. The other component that I would perhaps underscore for us is, rather than a right for our users, is a responsibility that we have as companies, and that's to never ever think that we have done as well as we can We can't ever say, okay, well, this is done and we don't have to look at this process again, or we don't have to look at this control again, or we don't have to look like, all right, that's all sorted for forever, right? Because if we aren't consistently pushing ourselves to get better, whether it's about notifying users about something, or transparency and granularity, or even just, you know, how users understand and interact with our platform, then we're inevitably going to miss things at an even faster rate than we might now, because there's just so much happening that we can never assume that we're done with anything.
And I think Mitchell Baker's comments earlier this morning, where she said, like, we've come a long way, actually, since we were in 2011. The dialogue that is happening here is far more mature and far more considered and nuanced than it was in our first conference. So there is a huge way to go still, and I think that the sand is moving underneath us all the time. The respect for user rights is the topic of this conference and this panel, and I'd like you to join me in thanking Ross from Google, Joe from Facebook, and Del from Twitter.